Moray House Trust was founded on the ethos that a culture thrives and develops, where ideas circulate and are robustly debated and interrogated. Over the past 10 years, we have convened panels to discuss everything from the state of West Indies cricket to constitutional reform. Oil is still relatively new to Guyana. Most of us are still learning about it. Over the past 5 years or so, a cluster of new websites, organizations, and media entities have emerged locally with a focus on the petroleum industry. Most are overwhelmingly, some might say unrelentingly, optimistic about a sector known to have its fair share of challenges. Perhaps to counter this, a few other outlets are correspondingly pessimistic. This polarizes the discourse. Depending on your source of news and circle of friends, you receive only rosy projections or a series of doomsday scenarios. On the one hand, there are the Pollyannas with a positive spin on every bit of oil news. On the other, there are the prophets of doom, for whom each new revelation spells a crisis. Caught in between, most of the citizenry, befuddled and preoccupied with the daily grind, tend to dismiss both as background noise. The Trust has hosted multiple events on the topic of oil and gas over the years. Our aim is, and has always been, to provide a forum for balanced debate and discussion. We believe that it is vital that there is space in the public sphere for critical analysis and debate. On each occasion that we convene a panel, we seek to have a broad spectrum of views represented. This may seem a simple task, but there are many obstacles to achieving it. It relies on a willingness across the spectrum to participate. Public discourse in Guyana is, in some respects, still in its infancy. For example, any questioning of official policy is immediately viewed as a criticism, whatever the forum. Over the years, the number of voices willing to challenge the prevailing orthodoxy in any matter related to oil and gas has dwindled. Those within the corridors of power seem either disdainful or unwilling to engage, except in situations where they control the script. For the record, we did, once again, seek out a public servant with relevant expertise to participate, once again, without success. Many in the private and public sector seem reluctant to speak, perhaps for fear of retribution or the loss of business opportunities. The composition of the panel reflects these difficulties. Public discourse in Guyana is also hyper-politicized. When there are critical issues requiring an informed public debate, this does not serve us well. For public discourse in Guyana to evolve, there must be multiple public spheres in which ideas and analysis can be exchanged. Discourse is not simply the release of ideas, information, or opinions. It is not a one-way street, a press release, or PR exercise. It relies also on an exchange of views, a willingness among the populace to speak up, and a willingness among those in power to listen. Moray House Trust, therefore, will continue to probe at areas of policy that require scrutiny and discussion. This does not mean that we are anti this or any other administration. It means that we are pro-debate, pro-analysis, and pro-discussion, anchored in data and detail. Whatever the obstacles, rest assured that the conversation will continue. The contract under discussion tonight is a prime example of the polarized discourse in Guyana. In some quarters, there is a deafening silence about the suboptimal terms secured. Elsewhere, calls for a renegotiation or for a rebalancing or even a regularizing of the 2016 PSA, a rising to a fever pitch. It is extremely odd that both major political parties, who can scarcely agree on anything else, share a marked lack of appetite for remedial action. Why is this? In the meantime, we, the public, remain woefully underinformed. As I stated at the start of a similar panel 18 months ago, 7 years after oil was discovered in Guyana's waters, the deficit of hard data in the public sphere is astonishing. Where are the locally produced maps of oil wells, charts and databases, inventories of marine life, and so forth? Surely the public should be drowning in up-to-date official data about the extraction and sale of our oil. Is the absence of data the result of incompetence, or is it a deliberate strategy? One member of the panel wrote of an information asymmetry in the newspapers a day or two ago. We can be sure that the oil majors do not lack data to inform their decision-making and deliberations. The lack of hard data in the public sphere hobbles our ability to analyze and understand what is going on. In addition, oil-related laws remain antiquated. Legislation has lingered in the system for years. Several key institutions still exist only on paper. In sum, strategy and policy frameworks seem to be caught in a perpetual lag behind events. To give one example, our gas reserves at 16 trillion cubic feet are now apparently classified as world-class. There is talk of formulating a gas master plan. Meanwhile, the billion-dollar gas-to-shore pipeline project rushes ahead. How can a project of this scope precede a master plan? Should it not flow from a master plan? Where action has been taken, it has often been marked by haste, controversy, a notable lack of consensus, and a defiance of professional advice, which makes one wonder how long the results will endure. As we flounder, the balance of power on the world stage is also in flux. World events make a review of the contract pertinent. Guyana is not the minnow that it was perhaps perceived to be in 2016. And its significant and growing oil reserves now have heightened strategic value. So there is much to discuss. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Vincent Adams. Dr. Adams has 30 years' experience with the US Department of Energy. He recently served as the director of Guyana's Environmental Protection Agency. He holds a doctorate in environmental engineering, degrees in groundwater hydrology and geological engineering and petroleum engineering, and a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering. Over to you, Dr. Adams.
You know, and I really did enjoy your introduction there, Isabelle. You took some of the words out of my mouth, so at least I don't have to bother with it. But nevertheless, I you know, just like you, and I'm sure members of the panel and Moray House, we find it that some key words that you use there, that how this whole discussion has been highly politicized. It's people are very underperformed as you read the blogs and you read the letters to the editors. So I think this here is an excellent forum for making sure that people are informed, so that we can have you know, some good discussions and debates over what you aptly describe as probably the most consequential agreement, at least in my lifetime, and probably forever, that leads the country in a direction one way or the other. Now, you know, as you look or you read stuff that is in the media, you would swear that Mr. Trotman, everything is put on his shoulders. Of course, I'm not here to defend him because, you know, I've been one of the biggest critics going way back from inception of the 2016 contract. But the only thing that we talk about is Mr. Trotman, and we tend not to remember that there was a 1999 contract. And if you compare the 1999 with the 2016 contract, the 1999 contract was signed by you know, the Honorable President at the time, Janet Jagan. So there are enough you know, criticism to go around on both sides of the aisle. So we shouldn't be making this political, because we should be looking for solutions and putting up our hands and, you know, accepting our mistakes as we move forward. So let me to get into the details. I want to just highlight a few differences between the 1999 contract and the 2016 contract. And you can see the difference if you put it side by side for every single item in the contract. It was very well thought out in 2016. They went through every single thing in detail in the 1999 contract and addressed every single line and word. In the 1999 contract, the contract was only signed between Mrs. Jagan and EEPGL, which is ESSO, which is a subsidiary of Exxon. We keep talking about Exxon, and I'm going to get to that in a little bit. Whereas the 2016 contract, they added 3 more contractors, and they're called contractors, which were, they added, besides the EEPGL or ESSO, they added HES, they added SANOC, CNOOC. Exxon or ESSO has 45% of shares, Exxon, not Exxon, HES 30, and SANOC 25. The royalty went from 1% to 2% from 1999 to 2000. There was an addition of $18 million in a signature bonus. They, of course, did not go with the $1 billion that I had recommended, $1 billion US dollars. And if you go back to February the 4th of 2018, when I caused a lot of stir when I was on the front page of Stabroek News, calling for renegotiation of the contract and a $1 billion signature bonus. So they did not take my advice, obviously. In addition to that, there was a $300,000 per year that Exxon is supposed to, or EPGL is supposed to give the government for environmental and social projects. Well, of course, when I was at EPA, I tried to get my hands on that 300, and it was just a gift. It was, nobody knew anything about it until I finally figured out it was with the GGMC. But nobody knew, even though there's a plan where you got to submit the plan before the start of each year, nothing of the sort. So I don't know what has happened to the money over the years. There's in addition to that, there's a $300,000 for training. So that's $600,000 per year. It also added that all Guyana's gas demands have to be met first before any sales of any gas. That was not, believe it or not, in the 1999 contract, there was that was not there. So that was added this time, and of course it comes in very handy now that we're putting to work. We want to utilize a lot of our gas. And then they removed the restrictions on destinations for export. Believe it or not, the government, there was restrictions on where our oil was supposed to be sold. It had to have permission from the government where it goes, with the exception of the United States. The only country that was exempted from that was the United States. And it added $1 million per year in rental versus a different type of an arrangement for rental. Now, the agreement in Article 2 of the agreement and the liabilities and indemnifications. The agreement, of course, is a PSA type contract, production sharing, which I, to be honest, I hate. I thought we should have gone, I've said it all the time, we should have gone with a concession type contract. And the big difference is with a PSA type contract, we do not have the capacity. You've got the cost oil is a nightmare for us. As you can tell, we can't even go and audit the cost oil whereas with the concession type contract, all it is royalties and taxes. And all you've got to do is to make sure that you understand how the meters are running. You make sure that they're accurate. And we've got enough electricians and mechanics to make sure that they're running accurately, and we can count barrels. So the concession type contract is much simpler. Liability, it's joint and several, and as these lawyers here on this call would understand, joint and liability is just like as a co-signature. So any one of the contractors could be held liable, one or all, except that, of course, EEPGL, which is the operator, had no assets at any time to cover any type of major liability. It says the contractor indemnifies the government against all actions for negligence. Now, that may sound nice and, and acceptable, except, wish you luck to go in a court of law to prove negligence against a company of Exxon. The other thing it says the liability is limited to insurance, including self-insurance. Now here you have EEPGL that wants to be self-insured without any assets to cover anything. And even if you go there and get insurance, which is what I forced Exxon to do when I was at EPA, the maximum amount of insurance in the market was 2.5 billion, which is what I forced them to go get. So here it is. You've got a limited amount, and of course we know that the BP Macondo, they ran in excess of 70 billion, and yes, I don't know what would happen to the government if it's stuck with that liability. Now it says also the contractor shall effect and at all times maintain insurance as required by applicable rules and regulations and of such type, and in such amount as is customary in the international petroleum industry in accordance with the good old oil field practice. That's the kind of flowery language you get throughout this document. And sometimes, it's frustrating because that's not the way you normally write these type of things, to leave it to interpretation. It should be stuff that you can measure, you can count, and it's vague. And when you leave it this vague, it's left to interpretation, and you give all kinds of loopholes to the contractor. Now, so what I did when I was at EPA, that I thought that language there was broad enough, especially when it says in accordance with the rules and regulations. I said, well, okay, so I told him, you've got to have beyond the insurance. You're going to go get insurance to begin with, no self-insurance anymore. You're going to get insurance. They went out 2.5 billion. I said, well, that's not enough. So I brought in now the parent company coverage. We had never had parent company coverage in the act, in the agreement. So I brought it into the permit, because remember what that language says. I don't think it was the intent. It says rules and regulations. Well, I'm setting the rules and regulations through the permit. So in this particular case, it was not that it wasn't there in the agreement. It was just a case as to whether they were going to follow it or not. So in the LISA 1 had already gone when I arrived. We went to LISA 2 now. So that's where we put the language into LISA 2. And it so happened that after I wrote the language myself, by the way. After LISA 2, it remained in every single permit, even up to the recent permits that we just signed, and we're bragging about it. But here's what happened. 12.1 of LISA 2 says, thou shalt have insurance. 12.4 says that the EPA shall routinely review that insurance policy to make sure that it's up to date, it's not changed, and you're paying your premium. 12.5 says the parent company has to cover anything over and beyond that insurance policy, or what EEPGL cannot cover. It's plain, simple language. 12.3 says, this permit is issued subject to the fulfillment of the obligations under the above, and in a correspondence dated March 20th, 2019, indicating the commitment of EEPGL to obtain such insurance for coverage of environmental liabilities in accordance with the requirements of the EPA and the Bank of Guyana. Failure to fulfill such obligations, commitments is a breach of the permit and will result in immediate cancellation. Guess what happened? It's in Liza 2. We went up and started Liza 2 without any of these requirements. So it's not a case where, you know, it's one thing to put stuff in writing. It's another thing to comply with it. And all I see Exxon doing from time to time is thumbing their noses at the laws of the land, but we are allowing them to do that. Exxon will only do what we allow them to do. They cannot go into any other country, I know for sure in the United States, and do what they're doing to them. And I don't blame them. Their only bottom line is to make as much money as possible. And they're gonna do whatever we allow them to do. The other thing is in the protection the social responsibility and protection of the environment, Article 28. And basically what it says, if contractors' failure to comply with permit results, listen to this here. If contractor failure to comply with permit results in damage to the environment, contractor shall not be obligated to remedy or clean up environmental damage that existed prior to commencement of operation or arises as a consequence of pre-existing environmental conditions. Now that anybody is going to say, okay, that's fair. Except guess what? We never did a baseline study to figure out what the existing condition is. So here we've got something happens. How are we going to prove that, you know, what the damages are above the baseline? The other thing is, in terms of the education, remember I told you there was $300,000 per year for the environment and social activities, and $300,000 a year for education. And there's even a plan for it where it says that you've got to come up with a plan 6 months before every year, and the contractor is supposed to put together every 6 months a performance, you know, in terms of how we're doing. Nobody knows where that is going, especially since we need capacity. Records, reports and information, Article 9. Confidentiality of records, and this is I guess this is why Isabelle talked about it. Information is being kept from the public for whatever reason there is, and we know what the reason is. All data, all information that is produced is submitted to the government of Guyana. They get the force, even if it has to be sent to a lab someplace, it has to come to the Guyana, to the government. But guess what's in that contract? All of that information and data are confidential, and can only be released with the consent of the contractor. Now that's grossly unusual. We own everything. We own the oil. We own the data from that oil. Unless it's proprietary data, they cannot decide whether we should be releasing the data unless it's proprietary. And everything, if it's proprietary, should be marked proprietary, or but nothing should be confidential. Production data, how much barrels of oil they produce, or any, that, or logs, and it should not be proprietary. They're not, and whatever they develop, by the way, it's still owned by us. There's a 7-day notice. We have to give them 7 days notice in order for us to visit any ship. Of course, I threw that aside, and in the permit I said we shall have access, unfettered access to that to your site, up to and including unannounced visit. Employment and training. It says the contractor hires to maximum extent practicable Guyanese citizens having appropriate qualifications and experience. Well, in a country such as us that never seen our development, there's no such experience and qualifications of our staff. And then again, we take that as a handshake. It doesn't say how much. It doesn't say, which is normally the case. Of course, there's lots of chat, even for goods and services. So some of the things that you normally put in place, or what we should have had, is a plan with specific percentages of required local personnel, how many people you're going to hire over a certain period of time, local goods and services, some of the contracts, like in Libya, and even some of the contracts that I manage in the United States, what you do in local communities without the expertise, etc., and without the capabilities, you add a premium. For example, you say, well, okay, your goods could cost 10 to 15% higher than an established company coming from outside, but they're equated the same, so you got to hire them. There's what is called a mentor protege program, where even though you don't have a qualified local company, you bring them on board anyway, and you get like a 3 years to bring them up to speed so that they can compete. But everything, you see, we go with these handshake type of an agreement, and we allow the contractor to interpret it, and then then these type of things happen. Because one of the things we're seeing right now, which is appalling, is the way that our workers are being treated in these operations. You read stuff such as they're barely getting minimum wage compared to foreigners. They're being treated like as second-class citizens. They've got to sit and wait for leftover food, and no type of good conditions. And then the government now, from what I read, is meeting with the agencies that are hiring them for the contractors. Well, they should be meeting with Exxon. It's in the contract. Exxon signed that contract with these obligations, which is not specific, albeit, but they're the ones responsible. The government should be holding Exxon responsible. Don't worry, but these little bit bitty companies, it's Exxon. They're the ones we should be holding their feet to the fire. Like I said, like in Libya, for example, in their contract, 50% of all of their contract work has to go to the local community. And believe it or not, it's the same thing we apply in the United States. In the contracts that I used to manage, when we go to these communities, 50% of the contract work has to go to local communities, applying the mentor protege program and the premium programs that I tell you about. So those are the kinds of things that I think we need to fix in the contract, but legislation is a key.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Vince. We move now to Frederick Collins, who has a professional background in human resources, insurance, and mathematics, and is the president of Transparency International Guyana, Inc.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Isabelle said, I'm Fred Collins, and I am the person for the time in charge of Transparency Institute Guyana, Inc., most commonly referred to sometimes as Transparency International Guyana. And one of the role that we see ourselves playing, we don't ever represent ourselves as experts in any matters, especially where petroleum is concerned. We, however, feel that we are quite competent to ask intelligent questions and to frame those questions in a way in which they would attract answers from people who know what we're talking about and who understand that the society is entitled to ask questions. So that is the role that Transparency Institute believes that it ought to play and which we are striving to play. And it's in that context that we have managed to make some kind of an impact on the discourse, which began, our input began in 2018 with our first article on the contract. And then in 2019, we developed our ideas. So those are on our website, they're on the OGGN website, and they're, of course, if you know how to search on the press in Stabroek News, which has been our main conduit to the public over the years. So with that in mind, let me go to the issues I want to raise for today. And they're as follows. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go pretty quickly, just giving you an overview of the issues as I see them. and leaving them for question time, leaving your questions for any expansion. So what are the critical contract issues? Number one, we see a culture of selective legal compliance has developed in Guyana, not just with oil. For example, I was, as I said, you know, we're not expected to be experts on everything. And when I inquired, well, what about campaign financing? I was informed by somebody who is much more aware of what has been going on in Guyana than I am, that we actually have campaign financing laws. It is in the ROPA, Representation of the People's Act, but nobody pays it any mind. That is the kind of thing I'm talking about when I say a culture of selective legal compliance has developed. It is that governments, opposition, whoever it is, when they come, they decide what laws, which part of the Constitution they are going to comply with and which they will ignore. So I do not understand for the life of me how we are going to be able to get any kind of accountability in this country, regardless of whether it's petroleum or else. Number two, along with this culture is a culture of silence as regarding the lack of compliance. Number three, going along with this is a culture of perfunctory compliance, as can be seen with the EPA. In other words, when they comply, it is, you know, we just give lip service to it. You say you need consultation, we listen to you and then we do precisely what we want. Number four, the question of whether a country can make real progress when officials can do what they please with the chief economic activity of a country arises. And that is what petroleum has become. This is the real situation of Guyana and the entire natural resource management, especially the Exxon contract as we see it. Now, what are the critical issues that are unresolved? Unresolved issues. Number one, the breach of the 60 block maximum. We have written extensively on this. I see the doc mentioning just now the history and a tendency to weigh the blame on the latter part. We have never made any, we have always insisted that what we call the original sin. That is the breach of the 60 block maximum, and that took place in 1999. And number two, the failure to put exploration to tender as required by precedent, by law, by the Constitution, and good petroleum management practice. We see that as the elephant, the whale, everything in the room. It is really amazing that we should even have an argument on whether exploration should have been under auction. And there is so much silence on it because as far as TIGI is concerned, there is almost a conspiracy of silence with regard to that. Number three, the failure of the Procurement Commission to function in a way, even when it was constituted, that included a culture of monitoring misalignment with constitutional requirements and making recommendations to Parliament for changes in legislation. That is how we would have expected a Procurement Commission to function, especially when you look at the Constitution and it puts a high premium on competition and getting fair value for money. The Constitution sets the stage for so many things. It is difficult for us to understand you can have that in the Constitution and you can have a Procurement Commission that just more or less it operates in what we consider to be a clerical fashion. More that is unresolved is how in the first place the agreement with ESSO morphed into an agreement with 3 companies. By that, we mean this thing about tweaking an agreement, which was supposed to be between 2 parties, and to make it become into agreement with 3 parties is a little bit of a puzzle, because those of us who have had any basic exposure to law, those of us who I have been a company secretary for a number of years in insurance as well. I have had to do with some of the top law firms in this country. You don't ever see an one agreement becoming another. You can have, as is stated in the agreement, that there's a provision for the heirs and assigns. So anybody with an interest can take over an agreement. But as my little check on the net showed today, is that if there is a material difference between the new arrangement and the first, the court will deem that you have made a new agreement and you have to make a new one. You don't, just because it's an assign, you claim that you tweak it and you deem that it is tweaked when you have such fundamental issues that have changed. So that's a mystery to me, that with all the legal brains we have in this country, there is, I think Chris Ram made a note of that in one of his articles, one of his columns. You have Article 27. This is the biggest problem. This agreement masquerades, whichever one, 2016 now we're going to come to, and the same thing for the first one, 1999. It says in Article 27, this agreement shall be governed by, interpreted, and construed in accordance with the laws of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. It says that, but when you read some of the clauses, it reads like it makes its own law. It's a law unto itself. It loves to state this in some way. Yeah, well, yes, it's in accordance with the law. It's not. It says, pursuant to the aforesaid recitals, SO made an application to the Minister for a Petroleum Prospecting License in accordance with Regulation 13 of the regulations hereafter defined over the area described in Annex A and shown on the map attached as Annex B. Well, at TIGI, we did not find an Annex B. But what we can tell you for sure is that Annex A was miscalculated. And as I said, we didn't see Annex B. The earliest map seems to be dated 2017. Now here is a snapshot from 1999 agreement. First schedule, description of the contract area. It says the area comprising approximately 60,000 square kilometers, described herein, consisting of reticular blocks identified herein and shown on the block reference map attached. Well, now, just to make sure you understand what are my credentials for saying that this was calculated incorrectly, as Isabel mentioned, I did some mathematics. This is not no big mystery calculation. This part of the contract, this was wrong. The area comprising approximately 60,000 square kilometers was wrong. And that is what is on the 1999 agreement. Now here's what the 2016 agreement says. This is the Stabroek Block contract area, and it says Annex B, and it was corrected in the 2016 contract, where it says the total area is 26,800 square kilometers, not 60,000. So somebody made a blunder with regard to this area. Area on a single license. And this is the biggest problem. The problem is not that the 26,800 square kilometers was issued to a company, to one company. And nobody seemed to have noticed that before TIGI got into it. I suspect that many people still don't understand what is the big deal. What we did wrong was we issued this entire tract of seabed on a single license. This is what it looks like in other countries. And this tells you the comparison to the area of Georgetown. Up Guyana's, the legal limit was 5,000 on a single license. And I will say that what we issued was, instead of the legal limit 5,073, we issued 26,800, which is over five times that. And I am going to stop there on a single license. And that is the part of the big problem that we face even now, because we cannot mitigate. It would have mitigated the absence of the ring fencing, because you would never have dreamt of moving from the expenses from one license over to another. And I will end there.
Darsh is a financial researcher and IT expert. He holds a master in computer engineering from the University of Toronto, and he's speaking tonight on behalf of the Oil and Gas Governance Network, which is a group advocating for transparency, accountability, and good governance. Over to you, Darsh.
Okay, thank you, Isabel. I'm going to share my screen, so let me know if it doesn't share properly. I'm going to look at the contract in terms of revenues that we should have gotten, let's say in 2021, compared to Suriname's contract, and then look at 2022 and say, hey, if we had ring fencing, which I'll explain later, how much should we have gotten, okay? So here is a quick comparison of the Stabroek contract against Suriname's contract. Suriname had about 100 million barrels of oil. I'm not sure if that's increased, but we have about 11 billion barrels of oil in reserve. In this presentation, I'll just concentrate on the royalty and the taxes, right? So in Guyana's case, the percentage of revenue that we collect is 2%. For Suriname, it's 6.25%, okay? In terms of corporate income taxes, the oil companies have to pay 36% of their profits to the Suriname for taxes. In the case of Guyana, the oil companies pay 0% taxes, okay? So I will go with regard to this comparison, sorry. I will show a little bit more detail, but why does it matter? There was a good article in December 2021 on the Stabroek News by Red Thread, and they did a survey, and they were saying, you know, 41% of Guyanese live on $5.50 US a day or less. And in that survey, they used a family of 2 adults and 1 child, and they showed, hey, those, when they did their survey, those folks were eating, you know, biscuits and cheese, and that was their breakfast and dinner. Okay. Now let's see why the oil revenues in terms of comparison to Suriname matters. Okay. We actually do not have the data to do for 2021 to actually do a good comparison because the government, as mentioned before, is not releasing the production data. And the government is signed up for this international standard called EEPGL. But I think there have been reviews, et cetera, and they're still not releasing this data. So what we have done at OGGN is try to estimate for 2021 how much oil revenues were generated. There is a government website, petroleum.gov.gy, that has a chart on that site. And if you look for 2021, you will see, if you eyeball it, you will see that at least for Lisa 1, which is the first well starting producing in December 2019, producing about 120,000 barrels a day. Just eyeballing that chart, you can see, okay, it comes out, let's say, as an estimate for 120,000 barrels a day over 2021. So doing the math on that, we said, okay, 120,000 barrels per day for 365 days at the average price for Brent crude in 2021, which was $70.68 US. The total revenues should have been about 3.1 billion US, okay? So now compare that, our Stabroek contract, compare that to Suriname. So if I look at the royalty, remember we get 2%, that should have worked out to a royalty of about $62 million US in 2021. Now, if we use the terms of the royalty in terms of the Suriname contract, that was 6.25%, we should have, if we had that type of contract, we would have gotten about 193 million US. So that's a difference of about 131 million US dollars. Now, in terms of taxes, the oil companies are actually taxed, but what's happening is the government is paying the taxes for the oil companies. So for 2021, we would have collected 0 taxes. If we were using the Suriname model where we're forcing the oil companies to pay taxes, the tax rate would be about 40%. And so they should have paid on their profit in 2021, about 155 million US in taxes. And Professor Ganga Ramdas actually had an article in Sunday's Stabroek News giving more details of how this figure was arrived at. Okay, so what does that mean for the 41% of folks living on $5.50 US a day or less? That actually works out to, if we add the giveaway of 132 million in royalties plus about 155 million in taxes, that's 268 million. And we have about 320,000 people. If I do 41% of 780,000 Guyanese, that works out about 900 US for 2021. If we had the Suriname contract that we would have collected, that's about 3 months' salary for the average worker in Guyana. Okay. So who benefits? Who's benefiting in 2021 from all this this oil that we're pumping? If you look at the Exxon share price for 2021, you can see it's almost doubled. Same for Hess, right? And as mentioned before, those are two partners in the Stabroek Block. CNOOC is the other partner. Okay. So let's look quickly at 2022. Now I have a lot of details on this page. I'm not going to go through all the details. But what I wanted to talk to with respect to the Liza 1 in 2022 is this concept of ring fencing. So we have for Liza 1 about $3.5 billion in capital costs, where capital costs is what you pay for the ships, etc. That should have already been paid off. Now, because of a lack of ring fencing, and ring fencing, if I look at this this diagram here, ring fencing prevents expenses from future projects from being put back on existing projects, right? But because we lack ring fencing in our contract, in our Stabroek contract, what's happening, expenses from Liza 2, which is in production, upcoming ones like Payara, Yellowtail, etc., and we have about 22 projects that will probably come into works. They will all come back, those expenses will all come back on Liza 1. So what is happening is, we will always be stuck at about around 14.5% of revenues for Liza 1. Now, if we had ring fencing, I'll just go through it quickly here. If we had ring fencing on Liza 1, we would, because we would have paid off our capital costs, we would be collecting about, for 2022, about $1.4 billion as part of profit share. And let's say we have the taxes in play also, that's $570 million US. Because we don't have ring fencing, our profit share from Liza 1 for 2022 would likely be around $548 million. Okay, so what does this actually, let's add those numbers up and see what that actually means. How much for 2022, because of lack of ring fencing, we're giving away about 1.4 billion US, right? And that works out to approximately $1 million for each of the 320,000 Guyanese living on $5.50 a day or less, right? So, we need to be more vocal. We need to have something change with this contract. And I think, as mentioned before at the start, it is strange that both major political parties are not calling for renegotiation. So what can you do, right? You can participate. We have TIGI, we have OGGN, there are other civil society organizations you can participate in. You can write letters to the newspapers. And one thing, you can question your local political representative. Why is it fair for this money to be going to the foreign oil company shareholders instead of to the Guyanese people?
We're moving now to Chris Ram's presentation. Chris has almost 50 years experience as an accountant and auditor. He is a civil society advocate, attorney at law, newspaper columnist, and holds an LLM in oil and gas. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Thanks, everybody, and good evening. My task is a fairly narrow one, is to address the question of the stability clause. And it's what I'm going to do. I will address briefly a few models of stability clauses. I will trace the development of the stability clauses, and then I go on to discuss some of the consequences and implications, and I will end probably on a very pessimistic note as to whether or not we will see any changes in any of our lifetimes. Where's the second slide? Now, in terms of stability clauses, there are various models. I trust you can see on the screen freezing clauses, which essentially freeze circumstances and conditions as of the date of the signing of the agreement. They prohibit any unilateral changes by any of the parties. Generally, that unilateral change refers to any attempt by a host state. Then we have balancing clauses, so that if there is in fact a change in legislation, regulation, practice, or anything like that, then there must be a compensating allowance to the oil companies so as to restore them to the position that they were at the date of signing of the agreement. There is also the question of allocation of burdens. Sometimes the burdens were to change. You might find that the agreement says where there's a state holding company, for example, that the cost will be shared or borne by the oil companies. What we have in Guyana is essentially the first three: freezing, prohibition, and balancing. It's almost the entire range of stability clauses. Now, stability clauses generally trace their history to the era of nationalization, which passed way before our own situation. After all, we have the Constitution, which guarantees private property, and we have the Investment Act, which also guarantees fair compensation. So in terms of any fear or threat of nationalization, that is effectively removed by statute and the Constitution of Guyana. Stability clauses have always been hotly contested. It's probably one of the most adjudicated areas in oil and gas contracts, whether stability clauses are in fact ought to bind a host state and whether it doesn't infringe on various forms and rights of the state. Because stability clauses often reach international fora, it's not surprising that any questions about stability clauses has been generally settled in favor of the oil companies. In other words, you're bound by your stability clauses. There's a recent case in Israel, which may have given hope, Movement for Quality Government in Israel versus the Prime Minister. I think it was Ariel Sharon, and which went in favor of protecting a stability clause for a period of 10 years. Our stability clause is for 40 years. The stability clauses can be said in terms of our agreements to have evolved. We have the 1999 model. Sorry, we have the 1999 agreement. We have the 2012 model and the 2016 agreement. Of course, this does not mean that there are not stability clauses in other contracts. We've got CGX, you've got Repsol, you've got Tullow. All of these companies have stability clauses in their contracts, but we tend, because Exxon has been a major producer, the first of its kind and so on, we tend to concentrate on the 2016 agreement, but actually stability clauses exist in all agreements, signed in the by the government of Guyana, successive governments. In the 1999 agreement, there was a single paragraph on Article 32 with 3 principal points: no unilateral increase in the obligations of the contractor, no reduction in the rights of the contractor existing as of the effective date, and any new laws, orders, or regulations negatively impacting the contractor's economic benefits required revisions and adjustments to maintain the contractor's economic entitlement existing as of the effective date. That's where you get, so you have both the freezing and you have the balancing. And that's the 1999 agreement. We then go on, and this is the one, and moderator, I have taken the liberty. I know you spoke, I'm supposed to be speaking of 1999 and 2016. I thought 2012 model agreement is particularly relevant to the discussion, and I hope I can prove why. I've paraphrased the agreement, but Article 32.1 forbids the government from amending, modifying, rescinding, terminating, declaring invalid, or anything like that without the written consent of the contractor. In other words, no unilateral change. After the signing of this agreement, the government cannot increase the economic burdens of the contractor by applying to this agreement any increase of any petroleum-related fiscal obligation. Now, as we know, and the panelists Darsh spoke about the taxes. Well, not only is there no tax, but we actually pay the taxes for the oil companies. So we can't even say we will stop paying your taxes if these, under the terms of these clauses. Under 32.3, the government is required to take affirmative actions to restore the lost benefits resulting from any changes in the laws of Guyana which adversely affect the economic benefits, including those resulting from the fiscal regime protected by the agreement. So we can see how they, and this is the model agreement. It has the feature of providing all the balances, freezing, prohibition of universal changes. And where the contractors' overall economic benefits are materially affected by actions or changes directly or indirectly, the contractor is required, or you can say he may do it, he's not necessarily forced to notify the government in writing. A meeting has to be held within 30 days of the contractor so notifying the government of any changes adverse to it. And changes in this case could even include environmental issues, labor issues, or any matters like that. A meeting has to be held within 30 days after such notification with the objective of agreement on remedial action to be taken by the government. Where the parties are unable to resolve their differences within 120 days, the matter is taken to arbitration. An arbitral tribunal is authorized to modify the agreement to reestablish the economic benefits to the contractors. Now, where this is not possible, the arbitral tribunal has the power. I didn't say this in this slide, but it does. It actually has the power to award damages to the contractor that fully compensated for the loss of economic benefits under the agreement, both historical and future. Now, not only are your hands tied, but your feet are also tied. So that, in fact, is a model on which the 2016 agreement was constructed. We'll examine who takes the blame in a couple minutes. So the 2016 agreement is identical, barring one or two words here or there, is identical to the model agreement. So what are some of my observations resulting from this state of affairs? The stability clause appeared in the Janet Jagan 1999 agreement. The stability clause was substantially expanded in the 2012 model agreement under Donald Ramotar. As you will see on the screen, the origin, the particular origin is uncertain. How did it start? Who initiated it? Who funded it? All of those matters. It was adopted in whole by Raphael Trotman in the 2016 agreement. A further consequence, which I have on the observation, is that potentially the contractor is protected for 40 years. 10 years under the exploration license, which is 433, and 30 years under the production license, which is 2010. You have a 20 years for a production license, and you have a renewal period for 10 years. Now, in the case of Exxon, the effective protection is 57 years because of an infamous bridging deed that allowed Exxon, I'm sorry, I said two petroleum agreement, I meant two petroleum agreements. They actually got two agreements. The legality of that is highly questionable. They were only entitled to a single agreement. There was a lot of arm twisting, as evidenced by a memo which Noel Dennison, head of the GGMC, sent to Raphael Trotman after his visit to the Houston campus at SO. They forced the government into entering into a second petroleum agreement. The 1999 agreement had some force majeure because of the issue with Suriname. Now, why we would have granted an entire force majeure for that whole range from Suriname to Venezuela, when the issues were located in a very narrow area, is a different question. That force majeure was granted by the PPP government. Now, one of the further observations I would make in relation to this stability clause, even the dollar amounts are fixed. So you give us $300,000 for education or whatever, petty cash, in 2016 and in 2056 is the same $300,000. That is one of the absurdities. But even that is protected under this stability clause. It means, I may have repeated myself. Let me see. Because Exxon was given not one, but two agreements, they will have enjoyed protection from 1999 to 2056, a period of 57 years, which Parliament could not touch them. I go on to say, the stability clause virtually neutralizes the Parliament until 2056, long after all the oil and increasingly the gas would have been extracted. It cannot even insist that all companies act promptly in controlling or cleaning up pollution. The minister has to give notice to the errant contractor that he, the minister, will be cleaning up, will be doing the cleaning up and billing the contractor later. That I mentioned Article 28.6 as my authority. There is an open question, in my view, whether this stability clause does not circumvent Article 65 of the Guyana Constitution, which gives Parliament unlimited powers to make laws for the country. My closing comments, there has been a depressing unwillingness of the government of the day to review the circumstances leading up to the 2016 agreement. I ask the question, is this because the same party had framed the Model 2012 agreement on which the 2016 agreement is based? The sin committed by Raphael Trotman is to apply a pre-discovery model to a post-discovery situation. I would close on the sad note that I am not optimistic that there will be other than an academic review of the contract, which has been going on since 2016, when we first heard about the tweaking of the 1999 agreement, to use the words of Mr. Trotman. I am in that group, which is not optimistic of any substantial change, any change to this agreement. We have two political parties who have been central to the agreement, and neither of them would want to expose the other. That's my contribution. Thank you very much.
Fred.
Quickly, I want to piggyback on what Chris said. I want to advise this meeting that our research qualifies all of the inabilities or abilities we have, and I think Chris will agree with what I'm about to say. On all of these contracts and all of the agreements, all the clauses being legal. In one of our articles, we pointed out that the EU model principles on relationship with multilaterals, et cetera, presuppose, it says that they must comply in order to qualify for all of these privileges. They must comply with the law. And if they breach the law of the country, clear implication is that those things can't stand. And I suppose that is why Exxon said they're worried or concerned about the case that OGGN has brought against them. Thanks.
Yeah, for Darsh, did you look at on the through the life? I know you looked at the year. Do you look through the life of the contract to see what would been the difference, or is it just the year 2020?
No, what I did is, so Global Witness had looked through the life of the contract.
Okay.
And they had said, $55 billion was lost on 8 billion barrels at $65 a barrel. I'd done some calculations, but I didn't update it for this presentation, which, right now we have 11 billion barrels. Let's say oil is about $100 a barrel. I'm sure you could just do some rough math. That will come out to a loss of the life of the contract, over 100 billion US, right? But I haven't gone back and done the exact thing. But you can sort of do the rough math on that. I do
And-
have the global
Sorry.
witness spreadsheets that I can, do that and give a more accurate number.
Okay, a second quick question, I hope. I noticed on your chart, on your production chart, that nice,
Yeah, let me project it back.
yeah.
Give me 1 second. Okay. This one, right?
Yeah, something really bothers me that is very serious. The EIA, which is the Bible, by the way, of any of these operations, that's why you do an EIA, which is to establish the most important thing is the safety envelope. And the safety, it says specifically the safe, these are the exact words. The safe operating limit is 120,000 barrels per day. You cannot exceed that amount. But what I'm seeing there is that they constantly, and I've written about this before, because when one of the seals broke, when they started flaring, when they were asked by the media what was their production at the time, they said 130,000 barrels per day. And then I thought they had backed off of it after a while, after I guess they got caught. But what you're showing there is that they're consistently operating above 120,000 barrels per day, which means that they're operating unsafely. You never ever exceed what is said is to be your safe operate. Those words are sacred. You should be, like in the United States, you'll be shut down immediately, and an investigation will be carried out, because this is what can cause some serious incidents that we may never be able to recover from. But here they are. I mean, this graph here shows it very, very clearly.
Okay, that's a fairly sobering thought to take forward. Are there any other comments from the
Yeah, I
within
just
the panel?
have one question, maybe for Chris. I think next year, 2023, there's going to be a global minimum tax of 15%. Do you have any comments with regard to how that would affect this agreement, the Stabroek Block agreement?
Well, I have raised that issue. I have commented in it, but it seems that it would be protected. It would not apply in relation to the in respect of our contract. It is that bad.
Chris, I've got a quick question. I know I saw John. A quick question. Was the 20, because I think you had mentioned it to me once, the 2012 model, was that an official thing, or is it in draft? Was it signed by the contractors too? Or because I never saw an official document.
No, well, sorry, it's a model, so it wouldn't be signed, but what it does have, the copy I have here, because it's a model, so it's going to be applied to the various people, and it says, signed by the minister responsible for petroleum, representing the government of the Republic of Guyana, His Excellency Donald Ramatar, President of the Republic of Guyana. So it came under that administration.
So was it only for the stability clause that it did that for, or was it for the entire contract? I know we had in 1990.
It's a model almost in its entirety.
Oh,
we often blame Exxon for rewriting this. No, the PPP did a good job in rewriting it.
Okay, question.
Right. Sorry, John has been waiting very patiently, so I think now we can maybe move to take some questions from the floor. We are running a little lag in timings. So John, yes, do go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I've listened attentively to Vince, to Fred, to Darsh, and what they have said can be summarized on a program run on MSNBC in the early 2019 on Burkina Faso, which seems to be a complete duplication here. And nobody has even mentioned Burkina Faso, what Exxon did here under the previous US government foreign secretary, which was fired on Donald Trump. Now, I've listened to the conversation. It sounds beautiful and it's very applicable and it's relevant and consistent and everything else. My question is, why can, if we have such a beautiful written legal contract starting all the way from Janet Jagan to current, why can't we enforce the contract? Standard law says a contract can be enforced in a court of law. That's my first question. Can anybody answer that one?
Well, I can, sorry, I can take a shot at it. Of course, we see it in, like I mentioned, it's clear as crystal clear in the environmental side that we are not enforcing. Now, you know, there are all kinds of speculations and reasons why, but it's so blatant. Here it is that you have something written into the permit, which is, by the way, the legal document that it's enshrined in the Act, the EPA Act, that says thou shalt have these things in place before you start up your operation to protect the country against any spiller. And yet they went ahead, Liza 2, this is a blatant example. They went ahead in Liza 2 and started up that operation. And then the exact same language, by the way, is also in all of the subsequent permit, even including the yellowtail that was recently approved. The language is there. They're saying, well, here, you know, we're protecting the environment. Yet you show that you do not intend to follow the laws of the land. And it's not Exxon's fault. It's the government fault to not enforce what they're supposed to be enforcing in compliance with these legal requirements. So, you know, it's a question that is puzzling. It should be puzzling to everybody.
Follow-up question. Why didn't we, in the initial stages when we were setting up this contract in 1999, why didn't we have a petroleum company set up by the Guyana government to oversee the complete situation? And to this day, we don't have one.
Hello, Isabelle, shall I make a comment, please?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
First of all, I hear John saying that he listened to me and the other speakers quite well, and he was wondering why the contract is the first part I understand. The second part, I am smiling because if he listened to me, he would have heard me say that is our problem. The problem is that we are selectively deciding what to enforce. So what pleases Exxon, we enforce. What pleases the government, what doesn't please them, we don't enforce. That is the problem. Now, finally, in terms of this oil company, I want to say that I wanted to take the opportunity to say, I noticed the Vice President responding to the IMF advice that that we ought not to have an oil company. And I want to say, I agree. I don't know what is his motivation, but I would agree with him perfectly that that is part of the snake oil advice, which you go on in the net, you see sometimes the IMF being snake oil advice being attributed to the IMF sometimes, except that I will add that that seems to be advice coming through them from an oil snake.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from the chat, and then I see Alyssa Trotz has her hand raised. So we'll move in that way, if that's okay. Bruce Lovell in the chat, given that sanctity of contracts is the oft repeated reason proffered by both major parties against renewal of the contract, what then are remediation measures to redress the situation?
Let me jump on that as well. That's been a sore point for me. This whole thing about sanctity of contract is a farce, okay? As Christopher noted in article, what is it, 32.1, whatever it is, it says that you can change on, as long as you have the consent of the other party. We have never even approached them. Nobody has shown me, we've been asking for this. We have never even approached Exxon to renegotiate or change the contract. And here's why the Sanctity thing is a sham. When I was at the EPA, this whole thing about what I talked about, I changed two things that was in the contract. I changed it in the permit. The insurance was one of those when I said the parent company has to cover anything over and above. First of all, you have to get insurance, no self-insurance. Cancel the self-insurance term because EEPGL does not have any assets to cover anything. You've got to get insurance. They went out, they came back with this 2.5 billion. And I said anything over and above that, the parent companies, Exxon, Sinop, etc., have to cover it. We changed that. They signed off for that in the permit. The other thing we changed in the permit, the agreement says we're supposed to give them 7 days notice to visit their ship. I said, no, we will have unfettered access to that ship, including unannounced visit. They signed off to that. So this whole thing about, so here it is that we at the EPA changed two big clauses in that agreement. They went along with it. And so this whole Sanctity thing, we've not even have the nerve to go to them and say, this is what I want, and I need to negotiate with you. When the government is out of, when it was in opposition, oh, it's the worst contract on the planet. When I get in there, you wait and see. I mean, we know, we all know about the adjectives that were described about this contract, and how, you know, how bad Raphael Trotman was. And when they got into office, guess what happened? And I'm not being political here because Raphael Trotman knows that they've gotten their fair share of criticism from me. So this whole thing about sanctity of contract, every time I hear it, you know, my blood pressure goes up because it's a sham. It's a cover for not having the nerve to approach Exxon. That's what it is.
Okay, thank you for that, Vince. And I will take Elisa's question. I noted in your presentation that you seem to be suggesting that you had, I have to choose my words very carefully, addressed some of the shortcomings in the contract in the way that you prepared the permit, or in the requirements in the permit. And I'm not sure that I've seen a discussion about this in the public, or heard one in the public sphere before. And so maybe it is, as you're directing us now, we should be looking very closely at the requirements in the permits and how those are being met. Because fair enough, this is about the contract and we're focused on that, but it seems to me that we also need to be keeping an eye on the permits and making sure that they also don't mutate in some way, and also that the provisions in there are honored, because that seems to be a concern. So sorry, I leapt in there. I'm now going to invite Elisa to make her question or comment.
Thanks, Isabel, and thank you, everyone. This has been really interesting and very disturbing, and I want to thank everybody for these very clear presentations. I have a comment and then actually a quick question for Chris. You know, the women in Red Thread have been meeting and talking about oil, and they put it clearest in the little that they started to discuss. One of the women said, it's like you have a mango tree in your yard and you don't have a ladder to climb up the tree and get the mango, so you have to get somebody to bring a ladder. They bring the ladder, they mess up your yard, they climb your tree, they took 40 mangoes, left you with 3, and then left you to clean up all the mess. This is what the contract sound like. And this is just with them beginning to talk about this. So I want to say, I mean, with all due respect, Vince, even what you're saying there, when you were doing all of that, Guyanese were not aware of all of these things that were going on. And it seems to me that there needs to be a public discussion. And I want to use this opportunity to just encourage people to think about calling for an independent commission of inquiry. Whether you're Black, Brown, Indigenous, PPP, PNC, APNU, whatever, a national independent commission of inquiry that seeks no fair, no favor, is independently constituted to get to the bottom, but that we can also use as a way of putting on the table the issues the Guyanese actually need to know about. Because the reason this is partly going on is because the issues aren't aired. And when they're aired in a way that most Guyanese cannot actually understand. And it seems to me a commission of inquiry is a way to get a public discussion going. And if you say it's independent, then neither of the two big political parties, both of which have gotten us into this mess, can say it is being partisan in one way or the other. And so with that, Chris, your presentation really shocked me. And I just wanted to ask you, is it at all, and I don't know much about how the law works, but is it at all possible to test the stability clause of the 2016 contract in a court all the way up to the CCJ as contravening the Guyana Constitution and the supremacy of Parliament when it comes to making laws? Is that an avenue that could be taken?
I think there is, and I should say as well, Alyssa, and I've said to this, and I've said this as well to the government, a commission of inquiry, even if the government is afraid of saying, look, we want to renegotiate or we call on ESO, let the commission of inquiry make that kind of recommendation, and then it would become that much more difficult. In terms of taking this matter, as I mentioned, the Israeli case is very useful. The problem is, Alyssa, and I'm going to be very factual here, it's a question of resources, and lots of people want to talk. Nobody wants to do real things and put up money. These things do cost money. But having said that, I'm delighted to hear, I think the mango tree or the mangoes analogy is original, it's wonderful. I'm glad to hear Red Thread Women. It's an organization I've always had the greatest of respect for. I would like to see it pushing for that we should have a commission of inquiry into the bridging deed, into the second contract, into the 2012 model agreement. We don't know who drew it up. Vince Adams doesn't know, and he was within the system, and he does not know. We need to know that. We need to know why we do not have a petroleum commission. The APNU had recommended it. The PPP at the conference, at the consultation on local content, Mr. Jagdeo said, yes, we will have it, but we're not going to have it. The reason why Vince was able to be successful, there was a second piece of legislation on which he could hang a hat and take some action. But because we do not have a petroleum commission, well, we've gone in the Natural Resource Fund, some strange things have happened there. But because we have separate environmental legislation, Vince was able to do some of the things that he did. But we need resources, we need consistency, we need Moray House to continue this exercise, and we need prominent international citizens like Alyssa Trotz to bring these matters to various fora around the world.
Hey, Chris,
Okay.
just quickly, let me just add to Chris. Again, we do not have, for whatever reason, we are so fearful of Exxon, we do not have the will to. Another reason why I was successful, Chris, is because from the very first I brought Exxon and all the big, especially the foreign companies, the mining companies, my first conversation that I always have with them, I will not accept anything less than what you have to abide with in other countries. If you guys remember, I was kind of very controversial. I shut down the two biggest mining companies in Guyana. I shut down Exxon for flaring, but that's what it takes. Exxon understands that. And these companies are gonna do what they're allowed to do. And in my case, I was, I'm thankful for Mr. Granger. He never interfered in anything that I had ever done. It's totally different now. Again, I don't want to get into politics, but these are the raw facts. That's not the same thing happening currently. It's totally politicized. The EPA and everything else is put aside. So I was able to do it because I had the will, and I draw the line as to how I'm going to operate. And they did exactly that because they know it's the right thing, and they're just going to do whatever we allow them to do. That's what's going on. We've got the law behind us, And they understand that, they understand where the power is, they understand what the law is and what the authority is. But if you do not enforce it, their thing is to make money, and they're going to make it as fast as possible, as much as possible, and do whatever it takes to make it. So that's the bottom line. That's what's happening.
Okay. Now, I'd just like to go back to a question in the chat. Darsh, this is going to involve you. It's the slide showing the difference between the Guyana and Suriname oil deals. And the question is, was this information available to Guyana at the time of contract preparation?
Yeah, I'm not sure if they had
it wasn't actually, I don't think. Someone else, I'm sure Vince can correct me, but the Suriname fine came post the signing of our 2016 PSA.
What? Sorry, what was, I didn't get it?
So the question in the chat is, can you show that slide with the stark difference between the Guyana and Suriname oil deals? Was this information available to Guyana at the time of contract preparation? And
No,
Darsh is showing the slide.
If the Suriname signed, you mean if Guyana signed a contract after Suriname, or?
I think if these, yes. So if these terms were the terms that the Surinamese secured were known to us at the time that we signed the 2016 agreement.
No,
Isabelle, if I may come in here.
Go ahead.
This is Mike Prasad. No, it does not. The Suriname contract was signed after.
That's as
I spoke with the folks in Suriname. One point more. I spoke with the folks in Suriname. They had hired professional people, experts, to negotiate on behalf of the Surinamese government. In Guyana's case, we local fellows who had no experience about these contracts, they negotiated, and this is what happened. Can I come in one point? My hand was up to ask a question. Should I wait for my turn, or can I?
So Mike, can I add something before you comment?
Okay.
So although the Suriname contract was signed after the Guyana's contract, if you look back at the Global Witness Open Oil Report, you will see that they quote from a 2012 government report where they analyzed, the IMF analyzed a lot of contracts in the world. And that report was saying, that's 2012, that report was saying the average take was between 65% and 85%. So yes, although it wasn't available, the Suriname stuff wasn't available to government in 2016, if they had gone and looked elsewhere, they could have found, you know, what were probably the average contracts out there.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Darsh. Yes, so we have, Mike, if you'd like to jump in with your question, and then
we'll Isabelle, I'm associated with OGGN. In New York, we have a very good friend, a owner of $1 billion hedge fund who has connections with big law firms. He contacted on our behalf a law firm in New York to see whether we can bring a lawsuit against this contract and against the government of Guyana. He in turn consulted that law firm, put us in contact with another law firm in London who specializes in these kind of cases. They looked at the whole matter and they advised negotiation. Lawsuits will tie you up in court for a long time. It will cost a lot of money. We contacted the government of Guyana. We wrote Minister Barrett, who said he would take the matter to cabinet, and he never got back to us. The law firm in London offered to enter into negotiations with Exxon on behalf of the government of Guyana if the government of Guyana would retain them. retain them at a cost, they have to talk with the law firm. The law firm might have been willing to do some for pro bono services. But the government of Guyana doesn't want to negotiate and never got back with us. The second thing, this contract is about politics. He advised that the whole thing is politics. It's not about what is written in the contract. That can be challenged in court. It's more politics. It's probably 95% politics. The government of Guyana does not want to negotiate. So this is a political matter. How do you deal with this? I would say, give my own personal answer. People in Guyana, the Guyanese people, have to take to the streets in peaceful picketing. Pressure will work. We have lots of examples where problems like this, if you take to the streets, the government will have to cave in. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now, we have quite a lot of questions coming. So I'm just going to give you the order in which we're going to take them. We're going to take a question from Mr. Modeste, then Mr. Passaud, then Red Thread Women, and then we're going to conclude with Ganga Ramdas because we're now a little bit over our time. So Mr. Modeste, and could we have a brief question or comment, please?
Yes, thanks again to Moray House for putting this on and to the panelists for coming forward. It's very informative. My question has to do with contract negotiation. In retrospect, now that we've seen the whole, let's say, process of what has happened with respect to the contract negotiations and to the results, because we've seen that we're not very happy with it, but also that, Exxon has basically been bolstered by the Guyana fine and many other companies. So we really had a lot more negotiating leverage. And the fact that we have sort of squandered that, does it give us any opportunity going forward with the rest of the potential resource that is there? And then just the second part of that is, there is a legal aspect to this. One of the things that is concerning is that there's a practice that happens a lot in the United States where entities tend to write laws for the legislators, and then they take those laws as written by the entities and put them into the system. And I think some of that may be happening here also. And I wondered if you guys have noticed any of that, and what specific laws are they being sort of presented to our legislators to just add into our Constitution, and what's the impact?
Chris or Vince, would you like to?
Yeah, I'm not sure I got the full question, but I mean, as far as legislation is concerned, here's another issue, environmental. If you've been following recently, I think the current opposition had presented some motions with some issues that I had even written about from time to time in the newspapers with flaring. So there was a motion presented, it was gutted completely. There was I think there were two motions and I can't remember the next one. Gutted completely, so no discussion in Parliament. So here's the House where he's supposed to be looking at these issues. The opposition, I think it's Mr. Patterson, who's on the other side. He had this motion, and it was completely gutted. I think there were two motions of the sort that would have, the Parliament would have looked at the issue and come up with a solution for resolving it. But it was just emasculated, and it didn't mean anything after the important points were removed. So if you're talking about legislation and dealing with it in Parliament, it's apparently it's not even happening there.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Moving on to Mr. Prasad, and can we have a fairly brief question, please?
Oh yes, I'm going to be as brief as possible. So I'd just like to begin by saying this has been an extraordinarily informative discourse. There are many, many questions I have, but there is just one that I think needs to be dealt with like immediately. The issue of the number of barrels that can be produced and the potential impact of a disaster. There's the notion that if something can go wrong, presume that it shall. And that would be something, I don't know how you would consider that, because it will have implications that are incalculable. And I mean, you know, it's awful. That is something that I think needs to be dealt with like last year. Thank you.
Let me add a little bit just to what had happened, and I raised it in the media, and of course the press asked the EPA, and here's the other problem with the EPA. We do not have anybody at the EPA who has any knowledge whatsoever. I mean, I'm talking about not a single course in petroleum engineering or anything of the sort. So anyways, I basically used to be doing all, which is okay, and try to mentor the kids. But when I brought it to the attention of the EPA and the media asked them, even wrote them a letter, asked them, their response was, the EIA also says that they can operate at 144,000 barrels per day. Well, that number was for a different purpose. That number was a modeling number to see what's the maximum flaring quantities that you're gonna get. It was for modeling purposes, not for operating. Regardless of whatever else was written, but they do not have experience in safety issues and writing EIAs. If the EIA says in plain words, the safe operating limit is 120,000 barrels per day, you don't need anything else. Those words, that sentence, you cannot exceed it. As a matter of fact, like in the United States, when the EIA or your permit says that your safe operating limit is 120,000 barrels per day, you're gonna make sure that you've got processes and procedures in place to operate at about 100,000 barrels per day, because you don't even want to come close to any mistake. But it's not in Guyana, they're exceeding it, and it's all because of greed. Well, and remember, just a few thousand barrels per day, 4,000 barrels per day, for example, just a difference of 4,000 or 5,000 barrels per day at the current war. You know how much income is that? $500,000.
Well, you see, the issues that I don't know that you have to be knowledgeable about this. You just have to look at the news. You look at the spill in the Gulf. You know, it's just it seems to be highly irresponsible. Yes, and it is. Flying away in face of what of common sense and knowledge about how you deal with potential for disaster.
And it's not another example. Not to take up, sorry, not to take up all your time. This whole thing about climate change and global warming, flaring, one of my favorite topics.
Yeah.
I hear everybody, even the vice president, bragging, we're getting a fee. Well, let me tell you what that fee means. And here's the other basic thing about when all you've got to do, right now they're flaring 5 million cubic feet of gas per day. And take this number down, folks, because you can do your own calculation. For every barrel of oil that comes up out the ground in Liza 1, it brings up 1,000 cubic feet of gas. Okay, so if you're flaring 4 million cubic feet, all you've got to do to cut back on that flaring is to cut back by 4,000 barrels per day. Or, if it's 5 million you're flaring, at one time they were flaring 15 million cubic feet, you cut back by 15,000. So from 120, you cut back by 50, you're still getting 105,000. Right now, they're saying they're flaring 5,000. So if you cut back, all you've got to do is cut back your production of oil from 120 to 115,000. You don't have to flare in, you take care of that. But guess what's the difference? That 5,000 barrels per day is revenue of about $500,000 per day. And when they say, well, okay, we're paying for it, guess how much is that fee? They're saying, well, we're paying $40 per ton of carbon dioxide. If you do your rough calculation, you know how much that comes out to? Believe it or not, about $8,000 per day. So there they are paying $8,000 to get $500,000. Is that an incentive or what? Wouldn't you take that as a business deal, as cost of doing business? So instead of stopping them, we're giving them an incentive to pollute the environment. And then you hear this nonsense, which really, you know, I can't believe it, that, well, it's polluter pay principle. That's nonsense. The polluter pay principle was never to pay to pollute. It was developed is to clean up the mess after it was polluted. If that's a policy, then you don't need an EPA. Anybody, as long as you can afford to pay to pollute, just come, just pollute. I'm going to charge you. Just go ahead and pollute as much as you want. So this whole polluter pays principle, they don't even understand what they're talking about. So that's the kind of issues that we're dealing with.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry, Mr. Pessoa, I'm going to move on to the poor old red thread has been waiting patiently. We're going to maybe take one more question, but we will have to bring things to a close fairly soon. So red thread, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Isabelle. Thank you, Moray House and the panel for the presentations. Chris, you were elusively clear. I want to ask what might be a naive but very serious question from Chris's presentation. Given what we're seeing in those stability clauses and the provisions in the stability clauses, why would successive governments and ministers sign to those conditions? I mean, what is the thinking? And I'm assuming that the people who were looking at these conditions were concerned about Guyana and concerned about fair deals for Guyana. So what is it that brought us to this place?
We honestly don't know. Incompetence, we just didn't give a damn who is the architect of the 2012 agreement. I think there has been no attention to detail. There's no attention to the consequences of what they signed. And we come right back. Let's push for a commission of inquiry and investigation, whatever. And at that point, we raised some of the issues that Mr. Modest talked about. All the rosy figures we're projecting, we're not thinking of some of the substantial risks we're going to have. I mean, there's a spill risk, there's a market risk, climate change risk, technical risk, you name them. We really, really do have serious challenges. The government of the day, the opposition of the day do not seem to be particularly concerned about it. We have got to examine them. I've seen messages coming across. Let us really form a group and do some serious analysis of some of these things. There's the Clyde and Company report, which is an indictment of how the 2016 report came into being. Nobody even talks about it. And, that leads to some frustration because you wonder whether it's really worthwhile after all of this. But I'm in, Alisa, I like the suggestion that we really need to form some kind of international group to push this, so to tackle, to access whatever resources might be available out there. We're novices when it comes to this matter, but it's not that they're not precedents on which we can go. They're not Guyanese themselves who have substantial expertise. So let's continue to try, but time is running, because one of the things the court will say, look, why have you waited this long? Glenal is facing that situation in the tax case that he has brought against the contract. We've got to move fast or faster.
Okay. Speaking of moving quickly, I see Charles Cambridge and JB with their hands raised. If you can ask your question in about 30 seconds each, we will certainly try to give it an airing, but we do need to bring things to a close. We have been going for nearly 2 hours.
Can I start? This is JB, Jackie Brown.
Mm-hmm.
I'm calling from Ottawa, Canada. I've been following this stuff going on in Guyana for a while. In the chat, I put Rachel Maddow's book, Blowout, which includes Guyana and tells us all about Exxon's behavior across the world. And what I'm insisting on, I've been trying to get on to people, and then somebody sent me this email today, this Zoom call. Let's form a coalition. We, the people, can fight this, because we have to go back eventually to the Congress of the United States so Exxon can reveal all the things it's doing. If you read Rachel Maddow's book, you get a sense of what it's done in Russia and all across the world, in Africa, how they've stolen from poorer countries who don't have the expertise to do this. And then we can put a stop to our government as well.
Okay.
Yeah, admittedly, I joined the discussion late, but all I'm hearing since I've joined are conflictual positions. And I'm wondering, what would it take for there to be a win-win situation to this opportunity that exists for the government and people of Guyana? For example, are there any discussions about the labor force, labor market, employment and manpower implications? So rather than forcing a conflictual win-lose position, can the parties come together and form a relationship that provides mutual gains for all considered? Exxon is not unaware or insensitive to what public relations, global relations would mean if they were to continue in a strategy of trying to defraud the government of Guyana. So rather than being conflictual, how can we bring about a win-win situation?
Now, I'm going to, if I may, I'm going to ask the panel to maybe address that if they can in their closing remarks. So panel, would you like to, in the order that you presented, just offer some closing remarks and maybe address some of this final question?
Well, the first thing I would get to is the government is in charge, and I mentioned this over and over. The government can call the shots. I really don't have any beef with Exxon. Like I said before, Exxon or any foreign company is going to do what the government wants them to do. If the government doesn't want them to follow the law, they're not going to follow the law. The government also has to be inclusive. They're Guyanese, I tell people all the time, they're Guyanese all over the world. For any position, any expertise, and in Guyana, you can get those people to in any aspect, even better than Exxon's expertise. But you know, those people are not included in the decision making. It's being made by politicians and friends. So that's the dilemma that we're in, and that's the only way we're gonna. That's the only thing that we're gonna get to a win-win situation. The government is in control. They've got to, and I'm talking about any government. It's not only they've got to include the right people, and they're Guyanese who want to help, but they're not being included in the decision making. And they've got when they come into the country, they've got to follow the laws.
Okay, Fred, did you have some concluding remarks?
Everyone, yeah, that unless we see, as seems to be coming out from several speakers, including the last, Mr. Cambridge, unless we recognize that it is a kind of politics that we've endured and supported, depending on what role we played over the last decades, over the few decades, last half century, that have delivered us into this situation. I don't agree with Vince about not blaming Exxon, because I come from my organization is an anti-corruption organization, and what we have seen is there's a long-term programming of hapless third world countries for this kind of making them prey to multinationals. And no doubt our politicians have been compromised over the decades by these manipulative instincts from these multinationals. That's all.
Thank you, Darsh.
Yeah, what I would say, so we, OGGN, we started about 5 years ago in somewhere in 2017. And we started a small group. We didn't have many folks, we didn't know much, etc. But we just kept at it, kept learning, participating, etc. So yes, this deal is so unfair etc. But the more we debate, participate, write letters, etc., the more knowledgeable we get, the more we increase the knowledge of the population. I'm always hopeful at some point, maybe not in a year, maybe not in 2 years, but at some point, you know, it will come to bear where the deal will get a fair deal. So that's always my hope. Well, we need the people to participate.
Thank you. Chris?
You know, I should say I was privileged to be part of this discussion this afternoon, not only for the panelists, but certainly the who's who in the audience. I take the point about we do want a win-win, but we also want a fair deal. And there are some things, it's good to hear, Red Fred, I come back to that. There was a piece of legislation passed the other day under the Local Content Act, equal pay for equal work. It's something that I think we need to push. We need to remove oil and gas as though it's just a male-dominated sector. There are jobs to be created. We should take those. We should take opportunities. You know, we say there is no ring fencing, but all the government has to do when it gives a production agreement is to say, look, you may not utilize the revenue from one field or from one license against exploration of another. There's so many things we can do. I'm really pleased to hear Boxing Girl and some of those comments. Let's get something moving, but we have to do so now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you to the panel, first and foremost, for once again stepping up to perhaps say what needs to be said, and for the research that and calculations that several of them undertook. So a couple of apologies from us. One is that Fred's screen sharing didn't work, so we didn't see his slides along with the with his presentation. And I understand that the live stream on Facebook somehow hasn't gone through. This will be, it has been recorded and it will be available on YouTube, on our YouTube channel from tomorrow. So for anyone who's missed it, you'll get a second chance to see it then. Thank you to the audience for the questions. This was always going to be an animated debate. And I don't think there are any easy answers. I think once again, we've possibly raised more questions for the future. I think we definitely need to look maybe a little more, in a little more forensic detail at the whole question of risk, because that seems to be appearing as a broad theme in a lot of these discussions again and again. And of course, we're all busy calculating what we gain, but we're not perhaps focusing every time a well is drilled, that's an additional risk. And if we're not supervising and monitoring these processes, then our risk is presumably heightened. So we need to be very, very much aware of that.